Welcome to Atlanta Diaries, a place to have meaningful conversations with breakthrough women to explore the ebb and flow of their unique journeys. I'm your host, Enma Popley. Thank you very much for joining me. My guest today is Dr. Ettie Zilber. Ettie has served as an educator and school leader at international schools in Israel, Singapore, China, Guatemala, Spain, and the US, and has also served as Adjunct Professor for various universities. As a consultant to internationally mobile communities, Ettie is passionate about sharing her experience, research, and strategies with communities worldwide, helping them thrive in a multicultural and multilingual world. After retiring from full-time work, Ettie now devotes her time to Holocaust education and has published a book about her family's Holocaust experiences. Ettie has been married for 48 years, has 3 wonderful children and 3 delightful grandchildren. So, welcome to the show, Ettie. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
As I am. Thank you, Enman. It's been a pleasure to get to know you.
Ettie, love to hear from you how your early years shaped your journey this far.
Well, I think early childhood years are the formative years for everybody. And in my particular case, they were very challenging years because I was born to parents who were immigrants and survivors of the Holocaust. And I myself was born after the war in a DP camp in Germany. So basically, we were all refugees coming to the United States with all of the well-known challenges of refugees. No money, no language, no contacts, pretty much alone in the world. So the early years for my parents were very difficult. And of course, that is felt by the child. So definitely I was formed by that. And in retrospect now at my age, I can look back and pretty much track the path from that directly to who I am today. So that's sort of the entree into our lives. And as an immigrant refugee, we were also minorities, part of the minorities here in the United States, being Jewish. So that also had an impact on me personally. And now I realize also professionally. So that's just a little intro.
Thank you very much. That's a great start. Let's begin with that. Talk to us about what are the different challenges you are talking about as an immigrant, as a minority.
Well, being an immigrant or being a newcomer is always challenging, no matter where it is. And I've done that a number of times, but certainly not under the same circumstances as my parents, because I've lived in different countries and I've moved numerous times. And each time it's a challenge, but the challenge was very, very different from my parents. Growing up, I had to learn English. English was not my first language. And so I learned English. And I started kindergarten, and I remember very well being put in a speech class because I had a Jewish accent. So, of course, they wanted to get rid of my accent. But I did well in school, had friends, but I always felt like an outsider. And I think that has always accompanied me throughout my life. And in fact, because of all my moves, I actually put myself in the position of being an outsider. So I'm a permanent outsider, which has a lot of advantages, I think. And in retrospect, professionally, I always identified with outsiders, people who were different. There was a tremendous empathy, and I chose to focus my career in this direction as well. So when I started my career, and that's a whole story unto itself, as a teacher in health and physical education, but then I specialized in adapted health and physical education and recreation for those with physical and mental disabilities, because they are different. And for me, the empathy went in that direction to help those people. Eventually, it also extended to the children that I worked with in all my international schools, who were what we now call third culture kids, who move around the world with their parents because of their parents' work. And they were also different and also had those same challenges. So I empathized with them, and that led me to doing research on them and publishing a book about them. Looking back, each of my experiences impacted my future, whether it was personally or professionally.
Interesting. You've had an amazing career and, like you said, navigated so many countries, worked across international schools, leadership roles. I want to double click on, was this intentional and deliberate or any other way?
No, it was pretty capricious, actually, and spontaneous, because there was never any plan. I enjoyed listening to speakers before on your podcast, young, vibrant, energetic women with a plan. And I never had a plan. Everything sort of just evolved in my life, and I would go with the flow. And if I had to change professions, I changed professions. If I had to change location, I changed location. I never, ever had a plan, certainly not for leadership. What I knew from home, and this was all three of us, my two sisters and I, we all had to go to college. We all had to have a profession with knowledge that could not be taken away from you. And that was the mantra at home. Nobody can take away from you what's in your head, because my parents had everything taken away from them, except what was in their heads. So I became a teacher because that's what was available for girls in my generational group. I'm a baby boomer. We had three choices. You could be a teacher, a nurse, or secretary. And I chose to become a teacher. And that's how it started. And never dawned on me to become an educational leader. That came much, much later. But that was pretty much how it started in my career.
Awesome. Thank you for this vulnerability and sharing. Ettie, I'm going to take a step back and shift gears. You had mentioned that your mother had dreamed of becoming a doctor herself, right? Which couldn't become a reality. What kind of a role did she play in your journey and that of your sisters?
Well, Mom was everything for us. She was our rock. Our father was a little more of an absent father. He went to work every day, and he had his hobbies, and he had his hobby room. And that's where he spent most of his hours. And if we wanted to see him, we had to go to the hobby room. He was an amateur radio enthusiast, a ham, as they call them. And so if we wanted to talk to him, we had to sit down and listen to him speak to the whole world on his radio. But Mom was everything. She was the motor. She organized everything. She ran the house. And she raised us, basically. And she was our model. And she was a model of resilience. And basically what she said went. She made the decisions. My parents were European when they were raising me. When I look at my younger sister, who is 13 years younger than I am, we always laugh in the family. Oh, you had different parents, because my parents were completely different with her, raising her. It's not surprising, but the DNA was the same, but the behavior was totally different, because they had already become more established. It was already more years past the trauma. They were more Americanized at that point. So we have a lot of laughs about our different parents. But Mom was the rock, and she made sure that we all went to college. And she was very, very encouraging. That was always her style. She always told us, you can do whatever you want to do, and you'll do great. Not only that, she always pumped us with her lifelong lessons. If somebody asks you if you know how to do something, just say yes. You'll figure it out later, which I realize now was survival skills. And that's exactly how she survived. I mean, some of the strategies. You just did what you had to do and you figured it out. So we learned a lot from mom, but she was omnipresent in our lives, and she was very special, very resilient, very tough woman, and sometimes you only appreciate it later.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Let's talk about your journey as an educator, Etty. Was there a turning point when you discovered leadership was your calling, or how did you traverse that journey?
I don't know if I would say that leadership was a calling. A calling, I think, by definition, is something you know you have early on. I knew I had leadership skills, even socially amongst my friends. My friends would listen to me, my ideas were well received, respected. So, but I never, ever thought of leadership professionally because that was just not part of my generation, nor did I have any models, right? I never had a female model who was a leader. So, never really thought about it. I was a teacher and that was it. At school, when I was teaching, ironically, I did become head of the little teachers union that we had at school. And so I did get a taste of some kind of leadership. And I was on different committees for professional development and so on. So I was heading up some committees, and I saw there that I had the skills. But once again, it did not enter into my mind that I must become the head of school one day. It just wasn't there. When did it pop up? When I was living and working in Singapore, and I was working at an international school. And I got a job in the middle of the year teaching English as a second language. I never got qualified in ESL, but I taught English at various times and privately and so on. But I made the switch to teaching English very, very quickly and did well, and my students did well. Anyway, my head of school came to me one day and he said, "Listen, I'd like you to take over the department. This is a department of over 20 staff members." I said, "You're kidding. I mean, you realize that I don't have the certification in this field, and there are many others who have much more experience and so on and so forth." He wouldn't let it go. He said, "No, I want you for this position." And I thought, oh, geez, this is going to be a problem. And eventually he convinced me to try it. And so that was my first taste of leadership, because I was leading a team of over 20 people and a school department of hundreds of students. And I saw that I actually liked it and wasn't too bad at it. So that was my first taste. I also first tasted the politics that went along with it. And that was probably the biggest surprise. But that comes with the territory.
Yep. Any anecdotes, any stories on how you navigated them? Tell us more about the different challenges.
The politics of leadership are just beyond description. In many cases, really ugly. And in other cases, confusing. And people's behavior sometimes very surprising. In the beginning, it was very hurtful. This is, one of my messages for anybody who wants to go into leadership. If you can't develop a thick skin, don't do it. Because you need to have a thick skin. Not everybody's going to love you. And since women are typically groomed to be loved and sweet and kind and good and nurturing, in a leadership position, many times you have to make difficult decisions, and you're going to make some people angry with those decisions. And you have to be able to free yourself from that socialization of being loved by everybody. So those were some of the difficulties. Exact the details, gosh, I could write a book about that one. Sabotage in general, trying to sabotage you in your position because somebody else wanted the position, not having enough political capital or even enough savvy to know, you're in the middle of a war, but you don't know where the shots are coming from. And this was my entree into head of school position in the first opportunity, having to exit people who are dangerous to children and to staff. This is something that is very distasteful, but has to be done. And unfortunately, I've had too much experience doing that, because my bottom line is, if it's not good for kids or it's dangerous for kids, it has to go. Those were some very, very difficult times. And everything else that goes along with a school community. A school community is a very unique ecosystem. It is amazing. And being the head of that kind of community is very different from being the CEO of a different kind of corporation. Because here you have so many different stakeholders. Number one, you think it's just about the kids? No. The kids are both the customer, the consumer, as well as the product. So that's already a bit of a conflict. Then you have the parents who are also the consumer or the client. But then in private schools, these same parents could also be on the board. So they are also your boss. And then you have the staff. In international schools, you're hiring staff from all over the world. So not only are you giving them a job, you're hiring them for a job, you're changing their life to a whole other country. And you pray that you made the right decision when you hired this person. So most of the time it worked out, but here and there were cases where it was a mistake. And then you have additional problems. And all of this entire community is highly charged because it's all based on emotion. Because what could be more important to a parent than their child? It's all emotional. It's a very hypercharged environment, which is very different from other places. So leading an organization like that, it's exciting and it's challenging.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Having said that, Ettie, from a manager to a leader, talk to me about what were your joys as a leader?
Well, first and foremost, observing that kids are happy and learning, and that there is a good atmosphere for them, and that these kids are going to go on and become adults, future leaders. That to me was a very, very important element of this job, having the impact to make sure that these kids are getting the education that they should. They're being developed in a way that will hopefully make them better citizens, better leaders, and hopefully a better world. That's what really is the essence of the job. And that gave me great pleasure. And it's, as a matter of fact, we have the 60th anniversary of one of the schools that I worked at, and the school is thriving. Really, it's impressive to see how far they've come. And I know that some of the policies that I introduced helped them become very successful. And so I'm planning on going for the anniversary party. And I'm very impressed with how far they've come. So that gives me joy. That gives me pleasure knowing that I had a part in that. As well in other schools that I've worked at. So, you always want to know that something you did had a positive impact. That's as good as it gets.
Absolutely. Did you ever feel imposter syndrome or self-doubt?
Sure. Just before I got the first position as head of school, definitely I didn't know it at the time, but I had a lot of anxiety. And now, we know the term imposter syndrome. Like, how can I do this? I got this job, but how the heck am I going to do it now? So, yes, I definitely felt that way. But like my mother said, you figure it out. That's what you do. You navigate it. And I did. I did develop myself professionally. I took courses, I studied, I read books, I spoke to other leaders. I had not too many, but I wouldn't call a mentor, but I had some other friends who I could call and ask for advice. But when you're starting out in the position, you don't know enough. You don't know which questions to ask, particularly when you're coming into a battlefield. That's all I can say. It's a battlefield. And you don't quite know how much of it is imposed on you or how much of it is because of your lack of experience. So you still have that going on in your head. What is causing these problems? And it took a while until I figured out that there's some sabotage going on. That was very, very difficult, but most people don't have that exact situation walking in the door. But as I said, you develop a thick skin and you move on.
Etty, you remember I mentioned to you that before I started the podcast, I did a little survey, an informal survey with around 300 women across the globe. And there were some interesting outcomes and some interesting learnings from the survey. And interestingly, they were quite consistent. So I'm going to share with you some of them and I'd love to get your perspective, right? The question which I heard was, how do you gain that rightful seat at the table? Clearly, you made a lot of effort to gain that rightful seat. Love to hear on how did you navigate that?
I started doing it by writing. I started writing articles and publishing professional articles. And I started publishing, which was completely new for me. And I realized that I was getting positive responses. I mean, it was great to see your name in print, in a journal or in a newsletter, a professional newsletter. That's when your name goes out there and people contact you. They ask you questions. That was my first entree. And then once you've published, you can then use that to promote yourself for the next position. I was always participating in regional conferences, professional conferences, and I gave workshops and I did training of other professionals. And so your name gets out there. And then at a certain point, I summed up the courage to apply for positions on certain professional associations. So I got onto their boards. So once you have developed that kind of name, you're sitting around a table, literally, and you have a say. Were these boards dominated by men? Yes. Yes, they were definitely dominated by men. And I learned very early that you're not always listened to, and other voices are louder than yours, but you just keep going. So that was an interesting journey, too.
Any anecdotes around that, Etty? How did you keep going? Or any times when you went through self-doubt, when you were not able to be louder than the other voices?
Yeah, sometimes when I'm in doubt, I sit quietly and I listen and I observe what's going on, who's got the power, who's got the microphone, who's got the voice. So that was in the beginning, that's how I started learning the game. And every industry has its own game. And in an academic industry like education or universities, the game is very, very unique. But I always noticed that my colleagues, male colleagues, had no problem just speaking off the cuff, not necessarily making any sense and just spouting off the mouth. And I would have to think 25 times before I raised my hand to speak, to make sure that what I was going to say was absolutely accurate and on target, appropriate at that moment, the whole emotional intelligence piece. I think that what I did to raise my profile, so to speak, was I volunteered for different committees. I ran those committees successfully. That plus all of my public exposure at conferences, my writings gave me more gravitas. And so people would listen when I spoke. So I think that's pretty much how I did it.
So once you knew where you're headed, you were very deliberate about making yourself successful.
Yes. And then I eventually went and got a doctoral degree. That was the other thing. Forgot about that one. I was pretty advanced in age when I did that, but I thought, okay, that's going to give me more influence, respect, you call it what you will, gravitas again, because when you're applying for a job, if your name is Dr. Zilber versus Mrs. Zilber, it makes a big difference in certain circles.
Absolutely. People find different strategies to make that voice heard or to build influence. And this comes from the upbringing, which was education. What stays in your head will never go out of your head.
Yes, that. And learning to read the cards, read the tea leaves, how to play, sounds harsh, how to play the game. It is a game. You have to learn the rules for this game. To say that I learned it very, very well, I would not say I did. I observed others who learned to play the game better than I, but it was good enough. And it was also, don't forget, I was much later in age when all of this took place. When I see young heads of schools, men in their 30s and early 40s, I didn't get into a head of school position till I was 50. So my trajectory was shorter. And that, again, I had other priorities. And it also, as I said, never entered my mind to become a head of school earlier in my career.
So with the wisdom of hindsight, would you have done it any differently?
Would I have done it any differently? Well, it's a matter of your priorities at the time. And again, when I look back at my life, all the things that I did in my life, I don't think I would have done any of that differently. Had I not moved to Israel, had I not married the man I married, had we not started moving internationally, had, you play that what if game, doing all of that, I couldn't have done anything differently. In fact, I'm very proud of the fact that everything we did well, and we succeeded. And within this framework, I managed to go into a leadership position with everything else that was going around, which includes marriage and 3 children. And that's a subject that I think, I don't care what anybody says, women have to think about it more than men do.
Considering that you navigated so many different cultures, traveled across the globe, literally, what kind of support systems did you have in place? How did you build them?
Well, in the beginning, I was the support because I originally, like many women of my generation, if you were working outside the house, which I was doing when I had my first child, you worked and then you worked in the home and you did the cooking and the cleaning and the shopping and everything else and take care of the children. And my husband was of a generation where they didn't really help at home. So those were the expectations. I might have resented it, but I didn't think there was anything wrong with it because that's the modeling I had at home also. And everybody else was at that same time in my generation, it was the same exact situation. It wasn't until we had the twins later on, and they were born prematurely, that's a whole other chapter, when he had to start helping. And so he did become a support. And then at some point, his company shipped us to Singapore. And I was the support for him, basically, because I took care of the kids while he went off to his new job. But then the roles changed much later. Once I started my position as a head of school, the roles changed, and he was no longer working for the company. He was self-employed. And so he started helping at home. In fact, I left home for a year for a position, and he stayed home with the kids, took care of the kids for that year when I went off for my first administrative position. And then they joined me the following year. So the roles changed. So he did become a support later on. And that would be, my advice to any woman who sees her path as a leader in whatever field and also wants to have a family. You need to make sure that you have the support, whether it's from your partner or whether it's you hire somebody to be that support at home. The other joke for this, behind every successful person is a wife. So everybody needs a wife.
That's so true.
And so if you're going to be in a leadership position, you need a wife at home. If you plan on having a family, and if you choose not to, that's fine too. But you can't go into it. I mean, there was a period of time, I remember, you can do it all. Oh, yes, women can do it all. And then there was a period of time where you can't do it all, not without support. And it will not bode well for the family, it will not bode well for your career, and it certainly won't bode well for your mental and physical health. So you can't do it all alone. And I was very fortunate. Well, as I said, I started this leadership career much later in life than most women today, but my kids were already older or out of the house. So that made a big difference too.
You talked about mentorship and it sounded like it was pretty organic, but any perspective on how do you think mentorship can be a part of somebody's growth plan? How did you play a role on anybody's mentorship journey?
That's a very good question. That was another one of my observations going through my professional journey about how men mentor each other. And I saw that visibly in my field. These old guys who were at that time my age now, right? Oh, you see that guy? I mentored him. You see that guy? Great guy. I mentored him. And all of these guys now had high-level positions. And the women didn't didn't have that same trajectory. You didn't hear a woman saying, "Oh, I mentored her." Well, through our regional associations and the ones that I was on the board or I was just a member, we took it upon ourselves to make a commitment to mentoring young female leaders or those with potential to become leaders or desire to become leaders. And so I was active in that, in mentoring. For 2 or 3 years of my school in Beijing, I had an all-female administrative team. My secondary principal and my elementary principal were both women, and both of them have gone on to great careers. And if you ask them, they would say that they learned a lot from me. And then there was a few other females on staff who I mentored, and today they're in leadership positions in schools. So yes, I think I have been active in mentoring. And having said that, I don't believe I ever had any mentoring. And I hope that that's no longer the case. But I don't think that women mentored each other, perhaps because there were not so many women in positions of leadership so that we could be mentored by them. So I don't know what the real reason is, but I would hope that more women mentor younger women or new leaders. And I think it's important. I think it's very important.
Yeah, in fact, this was another outcome of the survey where, I'd asked a question like, who's your woman role model? And many of them had nothing to say. And in fact, a lot of them said that women don't support other women.
Yeah, I would agree. Yes. In some cases, from my experience, there's also been sabotage. But I hope that that's a thing of the past. With more female leaders, then the younger women have more models. And so I think we need to reach out and continue that mentorship, seek out women to mentor. And the young ones perhaps need to find those mentors.
Yeah, I think the secret is in being deliberate about it, right? So that was one of the objectives of Atlanta Diaries, that, like you said, if there aren't enough women out there, I'm hoping through these conversations, we are going to scale that impact, right? I know 1 hour can't do enough, but I think it definitely can create that awareness and, help people understand it's a blind spot. Maybe those women are so sort of pursuing their own journey that they don't even sometimes realize that they need to also enable other journeys as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I think also because the journey is so challenging, maybe you just don't have the bandwidth to look back and say, oh, I should be helping these other people.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yet men do it almost naturally. So it is something that we need to learn to do better at.
Yeah. I'm going to talk about the most exciting part, or one of the things which completely inspire me, a master of 6 languages, Ettie. What inspired you to do that, and how did you even make it possible?
Well, I don't know that I mastered all 6 languages at what I consider an academic level, okay? But I can communicate in 6 languages. Let's put it that way. Now, because I have a degree in second language acquisition, so I know all the theories behind how the brain works as far as language acquisition centers and also teaching, how to teach second language. I've had phenomenal professors, some of the most famous second language acquisition professors, including Stephen Krashen, who's very well known in the field. But I actually developed my own theory of language acquisition when I was 12. Now I can say that I was right. When I was 12, I was basically raised with 2 languages. I mean, my home language was Yiddish, and then I had to learn English when I went to kindergarten. So basically, I was bilingual. And then in middle school, we had to choose a foreign language. This is a big joke in the United States about learning foreign languages. Most Americans, certainly my generation and even younger, oh, yeah, I took Spanish in high school. Yeah. Do they know how to speak Spanish? No, but I took it in high school. Anyway, I took it in middle school and I was acing it. It was so easy for me and pleasurable. I enjoyed it. I did well. But I looked around the classroom. None of my classmates were getting it. They were having so much difficulty. I said to myself, why are they having so much trouble? I mean, I found it fascinating. And at that time, I remember saying to myself, oh, it must be because I already know another language. So therefore, learning this third language is easy for me. And these other kids, they don't know any other language but English. And so it's difficult for them. And that's when I was 12 years old. And sure enough, when I went to high school, I added French. And then in college, I had the French as well. And I spoke pretty well. Then I moved to Israel and I had to learn Hebrew. And that's a whole different language, even though it's the same alphabet as Yiddish. So I had to learn Hebrew. And within a very short time, in 6 months, I had to get a job and start working using the language, and the language was not perfect by any means, but I didn't care. I had little smatterings of learnings of different languages based on my travels. But then when I moved to China, I was determined to learn Chinese. And in the 4 years that I lived in Beijing, I made it a point, I took lessons and I made it a point to be able to speak. So after 4 years, I could communicate well enough to get around by myself. And so I was very excited about that. And I just love it. I love it. I find it exciting. I find the connections in my brain. I know how to switch centers, language centers. And I just learn it. And I would imagine that other people who are multilingual have had that similar experience.
Did you feel that it was also a need, or it was just a passion?
No, not a fashion at all. It was always, well, I made the need. All right. I said, I need to know. When I studied Spanish and French in school, I had to pass the tests, right? So there's your need. And I did well and I enjoyed it on top of it. When I moved to Israel, the need was I have to integrate into this society. And at that time, most people didn't speak English. So if I was going to get into that society, you needed to speak the language. And I did. So that's need for sure. I needed to get a job. So you need to speak the language. In China, I said, I need to learn this language. That's it, period. It was my need to show myself that I could do it. And also the need to get along on the street because you're not always in the company of somebody who can translate for you. So I needed to be able to get along on the street. And my staff used to laugh and say, you better be careful what you say behind her back because she does understand everything.
Yeah.
Because typically with the foreigners in the school, they didn't necessarily know any Chinese, so the local people could always say what they wanted safely. But now they started laughing and saying, watch out, you can't say everything you want when she's around. My husband came back and forth. The children were already independent by that time. And my husband had some commitments back in the States, so he would be in the States, he would come out for blocks of time, we would travel together. So China was already a different period of time in our lives, in our family lives.
So, Etty, in the beginning of our conversation, you talked about working with different people and you said that's a strength, right? So, talk to us about how being different you felt was a springboard for your professional goals, and how would you help others understand how being different is a strength versus a challenge?
Again, in retrospect, I have the great advantage and luxury right now looking back over many, many years of a lifetime. And so I have the perspective to see that being different is a good thing. Now, no kid is going to tell you that they want to be different from their friends. Every kid wants to be like all their other friends. And so did I. And so did I as a kid. But I always knew that I was different. And I was able to see things differently because I was different. And that continued professionally as well. So I think that by being different, I was able to cross cultures because I came from one culture, but I was living in another. And anybody who lives as a minority group amongst the majority will tell you that they are different if they're honest, and that they have learned to navigate these two worlds, sometimes more than two. So I could navigate. I could be completely comfortable in this Jewish, Yiddish-speaking world, and I could be completely American, like any other Yankee, New Yorker, and talk like a real New Yorker if I wanted to. And I saw that early on, so I called it like a chameleon effect. Now, professionally, I saw that happening with my students because all of my students in the international school were also all different. They were different from the culture. They were different in the school culture. They were coming from all different cultures around the world with different languages. Their parents were different. And I found myself empathizing with these kids and trying to understand more about them. And that's when I started researching it. And eventually, that was the research I did for my doctoral dissertation, and eventually published a book about it. Then, with more research, I widened the field to cross-cultural kids and cross-cultural people who are not just the ones who are traveling around the world because of their parents' work, but they're the ones who happen to be immigrants to a country. They're the ones who happen to be children of bicultural marriages because they are also coming in contact with two different cultures. There's a whole collection of definitions under the umbrella of cross-culture kids or cross-culture adults. And I found that to be fascinating, and it holds true in all cases. You are always different, but you fit in almost everywhere. You can fit yourself in because you're already aware of how to survive in these different cultures. It's a tremendous skill. Think about it.
Any toolkit which you constantly had in your toolbox? If you had to share with a child or a, cross-culture kid, what's a strategy or a tool you will give them?
Once I became aware and active in this research and in this field, all my students had a workshop with me where I taught them about what was happening to them. And I taught them how they are different. And I taught them that being different is special. You are unique. You have certain skills. And they came out of these workshops with a completely different perspective on themselves. And then I also taught their parents about it, almost throwing a guilt trip on their parents by saying, look, you've chosen a certain lifestyle. You've made these decisions to live in Singapore. You've made decisions to live in China, in Buenos Aires, in Argentina. What happens to your children now? You've taken them away from your home culture. What happens to them? Many parents would come to me crying, my kid is losing our home language. My kid is losing the home culture. They don't know about our holidays. They don't know about our traditions. So I used to have special sessions for parents on how to deal with this and what they need to do if they want to maintain the home culture. And I have been doing and conducting such workshops for parents all over the world who are taking their children out of their home culture to live and work somewhere else for whatever reason. But they have to understand what's happening to them. I tell them, if you're putting your kid in an international school, even if you live in the country, even if that's your home culture, you're sending them into a different culture in the international school.
I know this is a whole chapter altogether, but if you had to give a snippet of that workshop, what is the one thing you will tell any listening parent who's brought their kid into a different culture?
If you want to assimilate into the majority culture, then fine, just let your kids go. They will assimilate. But if you want to maintain your home culture, your traditions, which many minorities do, I find that minorities think alike, regardless of where they came from. But if you want to maintain that, you have to work at it. You have to supply your child with what's missing that you want them to have, whether it's language, the native language, the home language, whether it's the foods, the holidays, the culture, the dance. I found it so interesting when I lived in Singapore. Now, Singapore is a microcosm. It's a phenomenal place. I loved living there. But I became very friendly with both local Indian minority groups and expat Indian minority groups. I visited India, I don't know, 6 or 7 times. I was fascinated. Why? One of the reasons, aside from learning all about variety of cultures in India, is the expat groups, when we would get together and talk, they were always talking, just like we were talking about what are we going to do with our kids and how are we going to, what's going to happen when we go back home, and what about the grandparents back home, and how do we maintain our kids' identity as Indian, or in my case, as Jewish or Israeli, right? And we were always having these conversations. I said, this is amazing. We're all talking about the same thing, but we all came from different places. So if that's what you want, then you have to work at it. So I saw my Indian friends, they would send their kids for dance lessons and sitar lessons and language lessons, and they would celebrate all the holidays and so on, just like we did. And that's what parents have to do if you want to maintain the culture, the home culture. And that takes work.
Very interesting. Etty, clearly there is no sign of retirement, right? You just finished publishing a book. Love to know more about your book and what was your last initiative.
Thanks for mentioning it. Yes. My first book was a professional book about third culture kids. This book is a personal book. It's about my family and their experiences in the Holocaust. And it's also about those experiences, those traumas, how they're transmitted to the next generation, how it impacted me as I saw it. And I've done I don't know, I guess a 360 on my life. I'm now very involved in Holocaust education. After publishing the book, I go into middle schools, high schools, universities, book clubs, community centers. I am invited to conferences to talk about my family's experiences in the Holocaust and educate the public about the Holocaust. And I'm also doing a lot of work promoting the book, obviously. But now I'm also working on a translation of a book from Yiddish to English about the Holocaust, which has never been translated to English. So I'm very busy with that, which was my original language, which I just find amazing that I could do this. So I'm very active here with the Phoenix Holocaust Association, and we have helped the legislation we've just legislated Holocaust education for all schools in Arizona. We were instrumental in that. So that's been my new path lately, and I don't use the word retirement, I use the word renaissance.
That's beautiful. So, Etty, like you know, I started Atlanta Diaries as a place where women professionals can learn and unlearn their definitions of success. What would you like to advise them as they listen in?
Well, as an old lady, I can give advice.
Perspective, let's call it perspective.
Yes, I'll give some perspective. Okay. So, like I said earlier, the first important thing is if this is important to you, if you see leadership, if you have this drive for leadership, I think it's great. I think that it's still an uphill battle. I don't believe that the glass ceiling has been completely smashed. You know, there's some cracks. So I think it's a wonderful thing if women seek out this kind of future for themselves professionally. But if you do, I think you have to also think about, is a family also in the cards for you? Is that something you also want to do? If not, that's perfectly okay. Perfectly okay. But if it is, you have to make sure that you have the proper support. Like I said, you have to make sure to have a wife, right? Whether you're paying for this wife or you live with the wife, and I'm saying that metaphorically, right?
Yep, of course.
You need to have the support at home, because to have a family and a career is very, very challenging. And so you can't do it all. That would be one piece of advice. The other, you have to grow a thick skin. In leadership, you have to have a thick skin. Not everybody's going to like you all the time. That's hard for some women to accept that, you're not liked. I think it's also hard for men, but I think women are also judged by a different standard. And that double standard does exist. And I think I'm speaking for my generation. We always thought that, if you just keep your elbows on the table and keep working hard and keep moving forward, you'll succeed. Sometimes it's not just a matter of the amount of work you do, it's the communicating that you do, networking. It's that kind of communication. It's getting yourself out in the public, being visible. That's important too. And I wish you the best of luck, whatever you decide. And it's great that you can choose your path more than in the past.
Sounds great. Sounds great. This was so wonderful, Ettie. Thank you very much. I'm sure this conversation is going to inspire and be very insightful for many women.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I am definitely somebody from a different generation, but I was pleased to hear the enthusiasm and the energy from the younger generation. So I hope that we all have something to learn from each other.
Absolutely. And I think leadership lessons are relevant at any level. So I'm sure there's a lot of perspective in all that you said. And thank you once again. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Atlanta Diaries in its entirety. I really hope you found the conversation insightful or inspiring. I really wish for Atlanta Diaries to be a place where we can learn and unlearn our definitions of success, build a community for the ones who may have multiple North Stars, and connect deeply beyond the limit of this audio file. I do have a request for you. Please share with others who you feel will benefit from this conversation. Because of these conversations, or even a small segment of them, can help champion the journey of even one woman, it'll be worth all the effort. I would love to get suggestions of breakthrough women from you to help strengthen my repertoire. I look forward to seeing you next week for another insightful conversation at Atlanta Diaries.